Hey guys, we've just studied the identity thesis in its strict sense. And remember, it goes like this. In an ontological sense, not necessarily in the way that it's reported, A equals B if and only if A and B are spatially and temporarily coexistent. So if anything has continuity over different spaces and different times, they're not exactly the same thing strictly. However, we can take a four-dimensional slice of it. And if we take a 4D slice, we'll find that they're in the same space and the same time. And we could argue, well, that's where it has its strict identity. So continuity over time and space is not what he's talking about when he's talking about identity in the strict sense, and he wants to distinguish between the two. Now remember, when we're talking about lightning and we're reporting it as lightning versus using the language of it being an electrical discharge, what we're doing is we're using different types of language to report on exactly the same ontological phenomena. And that word ontological means exist, the way it exists, the study of being. So really the best way to kind of get this is that lightning or the electrical discharge are really two different sides of the same ontological coin. They're two different ways of explaining or reporting on the same thing in the real world, okay? Which I think he is positing is separate from language or the way that we report phenomena, okay? So after this, our man Smart goes on and he looks at different possible predicted objections to his theory and he explores around about 8, I'm just double checking that, or is it 9? It's 8. It's 8 objections. We are going to leave out objection 3 and objection 8, and we are then going to explore all the others because the others just require direct knowledge that we have already. Objections 3 and 8 require deep knowledge of another philosopher by the name of Wittgenstein. All right. So, what are our small goals? Well, let's have a look at his. What we need to do is basically look at the objection and then have a look at how it refutes it or presents a rebuttal. So, we need to name and define and interrelate different key terms. We need to explore a summary of how he replies to a possible objection that he has predicted. And then we need to trace how he actually develops it by reading his language. Not just explore the summary, but look at his thoughts through language, which is going to give us much more nuance and much more detail. So can you write these down, please, and then score yourself out of 4 for each of these success criteria. All right, once you've done that, I want you to just answer this question. Is this a star or is it something else? Okay. So just another reminder, we don't look at objections 3 and 8 because they assume prior knowledge and pretty vast prior knowledge of Wittgenstein. And we don't need that for the study design, okay? So let's look at objection 1. And it goes like this. Aren't the two different things, the way that we report it? So for instance, lightning and the idea of the electric charge, aren't they different? Just like brain processes and sensation would be different. If a person can speak about lightning or speak about their sensation and has no knowledge at all of the electrical discharge or the scientific mechanisms that unfold, and similarly, brain processes. So let's have a look at our sentence. If a person can discuss and describe sensation but has no knowledge or knows nothing about brain processes, doesn't that mean that the two are something different? Take a note. All right, and to counter this, we get a discussion from Smart about what we call the morning star or the evening star. And, you know, when you go to bed, we see it. When you wake up, we see it. There's usually a star hanging around, depending on what time of the year it is. The problem is, though, it's not actually a star. It's not a star. It's actually Venus. But it has been called, before we knew that it was a planet, the morning star and the evening star. Can you take a note? All right, so the point is, depending on where you are on the Earth, depending on what time you are on the Earth, what we see in the morning and what we see at night time is the same thing. It is Venus, but we see it as a star, okay? And the ancient Greeks literally thought that Venus, when it looked like a star, was two different objects. Phosphorus, the bringer of light, the morning star, and Hesperus, the the bringer of the evening, or the start of evening, the evening star. Okay? Can you take a note? It was only 7 centuries later, when astronomy had advanced, that we realized that they were the same object. Take a note. Now, Smart completely rejects this argument. Take a note. All right. So, it basically says if a person has an idea of A and understands it, can report it, but is completely ignorant of B, that does not mean that B does not exist. Remember my little asterisk, sorry, my exclamation mark and equals means not. So it means, does not mean B is not. Do you get what I mean? So just because I can use the language of A but be completely ignorant of the language of B doesn't mean that B doesn't exist. Okay? Take a note. Now, when you apply that argument, it gets really clear, doesn't it? So let's just use this word sentence to kind of unpack that, okay? All right. If I know that if I report something as the evening star, that would be A, or report it as the morning star, whatever I want to call it. But I have no knowledge of the fact that it's a planet. That doesn't mean that it's not a planet. Take a note. And of course, to unpack this analogy and see where it's going, let's look at the brain processes. If I have knowledge of my experience of sensation, but no knowledge of brain processes, that doesn't mean that I don't have brain processes. That doesn't mean my brain processes don't exist. Take a note. All right, so let's say if we're standing around the globe at different perspectives, but we're watching Venus at the same time, depending on where we are on the globe, we will see it come up in the morning or we will see it in the evening. Okay? Now, this allows us to kind of harness the identity principle. Remember, it's got to be same space, same time. Okay? And that's what makes it the same thing. Right? Remember, X and Y can only be the same if and only if they are spatially and temporally coexistent. All right? And that's in an ontological sense, not in the way that it's reported or a linguistic sense. So, if we see the Venus as something different, like as the morning star or the evening star, it can still be the same, right? That doesn't mean just because one person sees the morning star, one person sees the evening star, that it's not Venus. Ontologically, it can still be Venus. We just have no knowledge of it being Venus. Take a note. Okay, so let's read this argument and see how it unfolds over time. I shall now discuss various possible objections to the view that the process reported in sensation statements are in fact processes in the brain. So he's going to discuss objections to his claim. Most of us have met some of these objections in our first year as philosophy students, all the more reason to take a good look at them. Others of the objections will be more recondite and subtle. So he's saying different objections will be a bit more subtle, a bit more nuanced. Okay, this is objection 1. An illiterate peasant can talk perfectly well about his after images, or how things look or feel to him, or about his aches and pains, and yet he may know nothing whatsoever about neurophysiology, which is another way of saying brain processes. So this is something we've already covered, but you might want to renote it. He basically says a peasant who doesn't have knowledge of science can talk about his sensations, but know nothing about the neurophysiology behind it. Take a note. A man, like Aristotle, a man may, like Aristotle, believe that the brain is an organ for cooling the body without any impairment of his ability to make true statements about his sensations. So I'm completely wrong about what the brain does, but I'm still making reasonably accurate statements about sensations. Take a note. That's what Aristotle, very learned man, said about the brain. Hence, the things we are talking about when we describe our sensations cannot be processes in the brain. So what he's saying basically is when we describe our sensations, they are different because in many cases, people just know nothing about the brain processes that underpin them. So how can they be talking about the same thing? Take a note. Here's his reply. You might as well say that a nation of sluggard-beds who never saw the morning star or knew of its existence, or who had never thought of the expression the morning star, but used the expression the evening star perfectly well, could not use this expression to refer to the same entity as we refer and describe it as the morning star. That's his clever way of saying, if you use this term evening star and never knew anything about the morning star because you didn't get up, well, you know, um, can you actually be referring to the same thing when you say evening star or morning star? You may object that the morning star is in a sense not the very same thing as the evening star, but only something spatio-temporally continuous with it. So saying actually your real objection is basically that the morning star is in a sense not the same thing as the evening star, but it just so happens to coincide with it spatially and temporally. That's a better definition of what we've said in the summary, so take a note. That is, you may say that the morning star is not the evening star in the strict sense of identity that I distinguished earlier. So what he's saying is, well, obviously if you see it at different times, how can it be the same thing? Because it needs to exist at the same time, same space. I can perhaps forestall this objection by considering the sluggard-beds to be New Zealanders in the early risers to be Englishmen. So this means that we're seeing it from different points of the globe at the same time and it's in the same space. Then the thing the New Zealanders describe as the morning star could be the very same thing in the strict sense as the Englishman describes, the evening star. So take a note about the New Zealander and the Englishman seeing it at the same time, right, depending on where they're at the globe, meaning and giving it a different description, i.e. morning star versus evening star. Can you take a note, please? And yet they could be ignorant of this fact, so they might not know that actually it is the same thing. There is, however, a more possible example. Consider lightning. Modern physical science tells us that lightning is a certain kind of electrical discharge due to the ionization of clouds of water vapor in the atmosphere. This is now It is now believed is what the true nature of lightning is. Note that there are not two things, a flash of lightning and an electrical discharge. There is only one thing, a flash of lightning, which is described scientifically. Alright, as an electrical discharge to the Earth from a cloud of ionized water molecules. The case is not at all like that of explaining a footprint by reference to a burglar. We say that what really lightning is, what its true nature is revealed to us by science, is an electric discharge. It is not the true nature of a footprint. It is not the true nature of a footprint to be a burglar. To forestall irrelevant objections, I should like to make it clear that by lightning I mean the publicly observable physical object lightning, not the visual sense datum of lightning. So again, he's saying it's the ontological thing that is both the same thing. It's just the language is used to report it differently. What I see as lightning is not what I'm talking about. That would be just the sense datum, my impression of what the lightning is through sense data, right? But ontologically, the thing causing the sense data is the same thing as the electrical discharge. All right, take a note. I say that the publicly observable physical object lightning is in fact the electrical discharge, not just a correlation of it. In other words, the two just don't coincide with each other directly at the same time. The one thing ontologically is causing the sense datum, and we can use science as a way to explain it, another way of what it actually is. The sense datum, or at least the having the sense datum of the look of lightning, may well be, my view, be a correlate of the electrical discharge. Okay, so here's what he's saying is the sense datum is the correlation, not the actual lightning itself. So the sensational impression I get of it is the correlation I have with the lightning, but it's not the lightning itself. The lightning just triggers the sense datum. For in my view, it is the brain state caused by the lightning. Alrighty. See, the sense datum is the brain state caused by the lightning. This is what we call classic behavioral kind of theory here, guys. Alright, we're trying to explain a behavior, or a disposition, I should say, referred to as brain state caused by the lightning. So take a note. The sense datum is the brain state caused by the lightning, but the lightning is the real phenomenological thing itself. It exists ontologically, is the same as the electrical discharge, but the electrical discharge generates the sensation or the sense datum of the lightning, which triggers the brain state caused by the lightning. In other words, the sense datum is a brain state caused by the lightning. Take a note. But we should no more confuse sensations of lightning with lightning than we confuse sensations of a table with the table. In other words, the table triggers the brain state of a particular, the sensation of the table triggers a particular correlated brain state with the table. All right, but the table and what we see as the table is the same thing, but the sense datum is the thing that's correlated, or the brain state is the thing that's correlated and occurs with it. So this is extra stuff that we're getting in a very nuanced way that we never really got when we read the summary. So keep that in mind, okay? Okay, so then we move on and we say, in short, I reply to the objection 1 that there can be contingent statements in the form of A is identical with B, and a person may well know that something is an A without knowing that it is a B. In an illiterate peasant might well be able to talk about his sensations without knowing about his brain processes, just as he can talk about lightning though he knows nothing about electricity. All right, so what this is saying is that some people may read my argument and say, okay, well, look, I'm willing to accept the fact that the ontological object itself is triggering off the brain state, or the ontological thing itself is creating the sense datum which triggers off the brain state. I get that. But the fact that, it's observed as something that correlates with it, makes us think about, well, look at the brain. Maybe the brain state, and this is where we get a lot deeper in the next argument, maybe the brain state is contingent. Maybe the sense datum or our experience of the sense datum is something that exists contingently over and above the actual brain process itself. Maybe that's something that we need to consider. And of course, he objects to that. All right. Now, don't worry about this sort of paragraph if you didn't really get it. I'm going to explain that a bit more in the future. But what's really important is that you get the majority of the theory that we've covered so far. Okay. So we have named and defined many key terms. Again, we've captured or recapped the strict sense of the identity thesis, and we've applied it to an analysis of what the evening and morning star is. It's Venus, it's the same object, and we've proven that it can be observed by two separate observers in a state where it has exactly the same, it meets the criteria for the strict identity. So it's observed exactly the same time and exactly the same space, just from two different perspectives, and it's described differently. But we know ontologically that the evening star is triggering off the sense datum or the brain state that directly correlates to our observation of the evening or morning star. Okay. We looked at that in the summary, and then we looked at it more developed here, much more developed, and we looked at this idea of, outside of the summary, the idea of brain state and sense datum being correlates of the ontological thing that triggers it off. All right. Now remember that word ontology really is important to get a lot of what our man's all about. Smart really is saying that there is something that exists ontologically, separately, from the way language reports it. And we're going to look at that in the next argument, because instead of just analyzing a separate phenomenon that triggers off the sense data, or the sense datum or the brain state that responds to the separate ontological thing, we're now going to ask ourselves, how can we argue that brain states or sense datums or brain processes are ontologically the same thing when they tend to be contingent? In other words, this brain state or this sense datum occurs when this brain process occurs. That's the next argument, okay? Pretty full on, but hey, you taught philosophy. That's what it is, man.